The day I walked into my bedroom and found my wife entangled with her boss, time seemed to freeze. Groceries slipped from my arms, apples rolling across the hardwood, while my heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst through my chest. The sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating the bed, our bed, where they lay in breathless shock. Everything I'd trusted, everything I'd sacrificed for, collapsed in an instant. My throat went dry as I realized the moans I'd heard from the hallway were my wife's, and the figure with her wasn't me. Now I tasted betrayal, bitter and sharp. I always thought our marriage was built on a rock-solid foundation, the kind that could endure life's storms. Layoffs, parental illnesses, rough patches in communication. We were each other's confidants. If someone had told me a year ago that Allison would be the one to break my heart, I'd have laughed them off. Yet looking back, there were signs I chose to ignore. Her suspiciously late returns from the office, the abrupt phone calls she'd hush up whenever I walked into the room, the way she seemed distant even in the quiet spaces we used to fill with easy conversation. I chalked it all up to stress. Allison worked as a paralegal for a cutthroat law firm, constantly pulled into emergencies by her demanding boss, Ronald. That boss was supposed to be a name on her paycheck, not the man who'd be in my bed with her. I can still see the shape of them under the sheets in my mind's eye, a memory that replays with nauseating clarity. The moment Ronald saw me, he stumbled out of bed, half-dressed, stammering apologies I barely registered. And my wife wore an expression of terror, guilt, and something else I still can't name. I stood frozen. My arms felt heavy, my mouth dry, words refusing to form. They both tried to speak at once, fumbling for excuses, but no sound could soften the image burned into my mind. I said nothing. Eventually, Ronald grabbed his clothes and bolted, leaving Allison to face my devastation alone. In the aftermath, my thoughts whirled between rage and heartbreak. I remember staggering to the living room, collapsing onto the couch that had once held so many nights of laughter and movie marathons. Allison followed, wrapping herself in a robe, mascara running down cheeks that had once looked so luminous to me. She began some half-baked explanation, how it was a mistake, how she never intended to hurt me, how Ronald had been pushing her to do more at work. I felt sick. My ears buzzed, and all I wanted was to erase the last hour from existence. The bed we shared, the place that was supposed to be our safest sanctuary, had become a battleground of betrayal. Allison reached out to touch me, but I flinched away, skin crawling at the thought of contact. In that moment, I realized something had shifted irreversibly. The trust that anchored our marriage was gone, snapped like a frail twig underfoot. My wife's tears fell freely, yet they did little to stir compassion in me. If she truly loved me, if she cared at all, how could she do something this vile under our own roof? Eventually, I told her to pack a bag and leave. She hesitated, eyes wide, insisting we talk it through, but the walls felt too tight, and her presence stifled me. I repeated my demand. This time, she obeyed, stuffing clothes into a suitcase while I stared numbly out the window. The door slammed behind her. I was alone, with nothing but the stench of betrayal lingering in the air. It's strange how quickly life can unravel. One day you're planning a weekend getaway with your wife, dreaming of starting a family, and the next you're sitting at the kitchen table, replaying the moment you realized she was cheating on you with her boss. That first night, I wandered around the house like a ghost, picking up items that reminded me of better times. The photo from our second anniversary by the lake, the souvenir magnets from a road trip we'd taken. Everything felt false. Each memory was tainted by the knowledge that Allison had chosen a man who was not me. I drank too much that night, finishing half a bottle of whiskey, and ended up asleep on the couch. In the morning, I woke with a throbbing headache, only to find a flurry of messages on my phone. Some were from Allison, begging me to talk, to let her explain further. Others were from friends who had no idea of the chaos unfolding. I turned my phone off, the last shred of my will urging me not to drown in her pleas. I couldn't face them or her. All I knew was that I needed answers. Why him, why now, and how long had this been going on? When I finally mustered the courage to call one of our closest friends, Nora, her shocked silence told me everything. She had suspected something was off with Allison for months. Apparently, Allison mentioned Ronald's overly friendly manner more than a few times, but Nora never imagined it would escalate into a full-blown affair. I felt a bitter laugh escape me. Maybe I should have confided my suspicions to someone earlier. Maybe I could have stopped it, or maybe I would have saved myself from some illusions. But regrets and maybes were a moot point now. What was done, and the only path was forward. A part of me yearned to see Allison again, to gauge if any of her remorse was real. Another part wanted to burn every trace of her existence from my life. She was my wife, my partner in everything, But she had cut me so deeply I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive. Nora asked me what my plan was. I had none. I just knew I couldn't keep living in the same house we'd shared. My sense of security, my faith in love, was pulverized. Days turned into weeks. Allison attempted to contact me daily, showing up at the door sometimes, weeping about how Ronald had pressured her, how she'd been lonely, how it was a dreadful mistake. I refused to let her in, shouting through the door that I needed space. Each time she left, her sobs echoing down the hallway, I felt a pang of something: loss, anger, sorrow. Meanwhile, I discovered through a coworker of Allison's that Ronald was married with 2 kids, making the betrayal even more twisted. My mind spun with thoughts of his family, wondering if they'd also discovered the affair. Guilt mingled with hatred. My wife had become an accomplice in wrecking not just my life, but possibly an entire household. The knowledge made me sick to my stomach. Late nights found me ruminating about what I lacked that Ronald apparently possessed. Was it money, status, a sense of power? Or was Allison just bored with me, seeking a thrill? The questions grated at my self-esteem, leaving me with more emptiness than answers. When I finally caved and allowed Allison to enter the house for a conversation, she looked like a shadow of her former self. Her hair was messy, her cheeks hollow from tears, eyes puffy with regret. My anger flared at the sight of her, but a piece of me pitied the disheveled woman standing in front of me. She confessed that Ronald seduced her with promises of career advancement, of excitement. She admitted she'd been frustrated with our routine, that she craved some spark. My stomach churned as she spoke. So our stable life was too dull for her, and hooking up with her boss in our bed was the solution? She tried to hold my hand. I recoiled. Apologies spilled from her lips, but they felt meaningless. I asked her where she was living now. She said Ronald had cut her loose when everything came to light, likely to protect his own marriage and reputation. She'd lost her job because the law firm had a strict policy against fraternizing, especially when it involved a married boss and subordinate. She was couch surfing with a friend, borderline homeless. She'd come to me not just for forgiveness but for a place to stay. I stared at her in disbelief. After all she'd done, she had the nerve to ask me for shelter? My fury reached a boiling point. I told her in no uncertain terms that she'd burned the bridges. The bed she'd shared with Ronald was no longer hers to return to. The betrayal was too raw, too deep, for me to consider letting her back into the life she had just shattered. The tears welled up again, but I was unmoved. She insisted we could rebuild, that we could go to counseling, but I shut her down. This house was once ours, but the moment she brought another man into it, she forfeited her right to call it home. With that final blow, I demanded she leave. She obeyed, shoulders sagging. I felt a twisted pang in my chest, but I shoved it aside. My pride, my sense of self-respect, demanded I stand firm. As word got around about the affair, sympathy from family and friends poured in for me. Some offered help or a spare room if I needed to escape the memories. Others vented their fury at Allison's betrayal, urging me to file for divorce immediately. And so I did. I walked into a lawyer's office, laid out the situation, and explained I wanted a swift end to our marriage. The lawyer mentioned possible legal advantages, like citing infidelity for a more favorable settlement, but I found no solace in the idea of punishing her further than she'd already punished herself. She was jobless, effectively blacklisted from her firm after the scandal. Ronald, apparently worried about legal repercussions, had parted ways with her entirely. She had no home, no stable income, and no support from her once respectable career. Part of me found grim satisfaction in that. Another part was stunned by how quickly she'd destroyed everything during this time. I tried to piece my life back together. I replaced the bed sheets, repainted the bedroom walls in a new color, small gestures to reclaim my sense of ownership. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects. The ache in my chest persisted, especially at night when I'd look at old photos or remember the simpler times before everything unraveled. But I pressed on, determined not to let her betrayal define me. My nights were quiet now, the emptiness of our once shared routines haunting me. Yet, oddly, it was better than the seething anger that used to keep me awake. One evening, about 2 months after the discovery, Allison reappeared on my doorstep again. She looked even worse than before, her cheeks gaunt, her eyes hollow with desperation. She told me she'd run out of friends willing to accommodate her. The law firm circle was closed to her, and her reputation in the legal field was shot. She couldn't land interviews and she had no savings to speak of. Her boss had manipulated her, dangled promotions in front of her, and now left her with nothing. She was living out of her car, a battered sedan that barely ran. She pleaded for just a small corner in our garage, some place to sleep that wasn't the backseat of a vehicle. My heart twisted. Even after all she did, seeing her in such a state was painful. She was once the woman I adored, who used to laugh with me over silly inside jokes, who cried tears of joy when we adopted our puppy together. But that was another lifetime. I told her I was sorry for her predicament, but she had made her bed. Compassion was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. She sobbed, insisting she understood the gravity of her mistakes, begging me for any chance to earn back my trust. I stayed firm, though a pang of sorrow threatened to crack me. Ultimately, I told her she needed to leave. She did, tears trailing behind her. Despite my outward resolve, I wrestled with guilt and sorrow. Had I become too callous? She was homeless, jobless, and clearly repentant. But then again, the memory of walking in on her and Ronald in our bed burned in my mind, reminding me why I had to protect myself. I went to therapy, confiding in a counselor about the tidal wave of betrayal I faced. The therapist told me it was normal to feel torn, but that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or letting someone back into your life. For my own healing, I needed boundaries. If Allison found redemption, it would have to be on her terms, not at the expense of my mental well-being. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a message from Allison. She apologized again, saying she understood I might never forgive her, but she wanted me to know that Ronald was facing consequences too. Apparently, his wife had filed for divorce and his law career was in jeopardy. Part of me felt a grim vindication. At least he wasn't skipping away scot-free while my life lay in tatters. She ended the message saying she missed me every day, that she'd do anything to mend the pieces. I didn't respond. Some wounds are too deep for a simple text to heal. Divorce proceedings moved forward. In our state, because of her documented infidelity, the court was more sympathetic to my position. The lawyer suggested I could push for everything, the house, the assets. At first, I was hesitant. We once planned to share these things to build a future around them. But she'd taken that future and stomped on it. Why should I give her a foothold in my life? When we finally met at the negotiation table, Allison looked small, dwarfed by the conference room's polished table and her own guilt. She quietly agreed to my terms, dividing the assets heavily in my favor. She said she had no fight left, that she just wanted me to be okay. I felt a pang of pity, but I also remembered how she turned her back on me for a fleeting thrill. The judge officially granted the dissolution of our marriage. Just like that, we were strangers in legal terms. After the divorce, I struggled with an odd emptiness. 4 years, my identity was tied up in being Allison's husband. Now, I had my home, but it felt different. The echoes of what happened still lingered. Even so, I used the finality of divorce as a catalyst for change. I adopted a new dog from the shelter, someone to keep me company in a house that felt too silent. I reconnected with old friends, said yes to social invitations I once declined. I even started traveling on weekends, exploring national parks, taking scenic drives. Each step helped me reclaim the sense of self lost in the chaos of betrayal. Allison tried to contact me again, this time more desperate than before. She'd lost her car when she couldn't keep up with payments. She was crashing at a distant cousin's place, but that was running its course. She confessed she often dreamt about us returning to a simpler time, about me giving her a second chance. My heart clenched reading her words. I remembered the day she said, "I do," the softness in her eyes when we used to talk about building a life together. It was painful to think how swiftly she threw it away for a cheap fling with her boss. I had no illusions that it was a one-time mistake. Affairs don't happen spontaneously. They're built on small decisions, small lies, that accumulate until a bed is shared. Letting her back in would mean living with that knowledge forever. I wrote her a long, unsent letter in my journal, pouring out every hurt, every crushed dream. But I never sent it. Instead, I let that letter be my closure. The reality was that while I felt pity for her plight, I couldn't sacrifice my hard-won peace to rescue her. She needed to face the consequences of her choices. I wished her well privately, hoping she'd learn from this, but I wouldn't jeopardize my healing by re-engaging in a relationship that was irreversibly tarnished. Months slipped by. My healing progressed slowly, with setbacks on anniversaries or random days when memories blindsided me. But little by little, I felt more stable. I found new hobbies, kayaking on weekends, dabbling in photography. I discovered a circle of single friends who understood heartbreak, people who didn't judge my reluctance to date again. Through them, I learned the value of rebuilding at my own pace. Every so often, rumors about Allison trickled back to me. People said she was still unemployed, struggling with a tarnished reputation in the legal field, picking up odd jobs as a receptionist or barista. She no longer had the boss who once promised career advancements. She no longer had the comfortable home we shared. She'd have to start from scratch. Some told me she was sorry, that she believed I'd eventually come around. Others said she was bitter, blaming Ronald for leading her astray. Maybe both were true. Either way, her life was in disarray while I was learning to stand on my own again. In a way, that was more retribution than I could ever orchestrate myself. I considered therapy sessions for couples, or at least a single conversation to see if closure was possible. But each time I imagined meeting her face to face, I recalled the vile image of her in bed with Ronald, in the place that used to be our sanctuary. My entire body tensed at the memory. No, some lines can't be uncrossed. Perhaps I could forgive, but that forgiveness wouldn't translate into forgetting or reconciling. I needed to preserve what little self-respect remained. Eventually, I filed away all reminders of our marriage. Photos, keepsakes, even the wedding album. They went into a box in the attic, out of sight. My day-to-day life became simpler, quieter. I got used to doing groceries alone, cooking for one, sleeping in a bed that felt far too big. Over time, the loneliness became more of a gentle ache than a stabbing pain. I realized that, ironically, Allison's betrayal forced me to examine who I was without her. I discovered an inner strength I might never have tapped otherwise. My sense of empathy grew too. I refused to let bitterness define me, though caution now underscored the idea of trust. A year after the divorce, I found a new job opportunity that involved traveling around the country to oversee projects for my firm. Felt like a fresh chapter. I sold the house, too many memories attached to those walls, and moved closer to my parents for a while, storing what few possessions I kept in a friend's garage. Freed from the ghosts of that old bedroom, I threw myself into this new role. My dog traveled with me, an ever-faithful companion. We'd explore unfamiliar towns, meet new faces, learn that life could still surprise me in positive ways. At some point, I learned Allison had tried to track me down, maybe to beg for yet another chance or to update me on her situation. She never found me. Friends told me she was still drifting from one short-term living arrangement to another, heartbreak etched on her face. She might have realized too late that she traded stability and genuine love for a fleeting rush with her boss. That knowledge didn't bring me joy, just a sort of resigned sadness. Our paths had diverged, and I no longer felt the urge to double back. I occasionally reflect on what might have been if I'd come home later that day, never stumbling upon the affair in progress. Maybe the lies would have continued indefinitely. Maybe Allison would have ended it quietly, or maybe it would have imploded another way. I'm not sure which scenario is worse. At least by catching them in the act, I had no illusions left. The cut was deep, but it was clean in its own twisted way. I could move forward with no second-guessing about whether I was reading too much into some text or phone call. There was no ambiguity. She was unfaithful in the most blatant manner possible. In time, the memory lost some of its power. I found that I could talk about the betrayal without my hands shaking, without tears threatening to spill. People would ask me how I managed to keep going. I'd reply that sometimes heartbreak is the catalyst for growth. I chose to see it that way anyway. We can't control what others do, but we can decide what to do with the aftermath. For me, letting her back in would have prolonged the cycle of hurt. So I closed the door and pressed on, forging a path that was my own. Now, looking back, I see how her affair with Ronald revealed deeper issues we ignored: discontent, poor communication, drifting intimacy. But none of those justified her actions. Betrayal is betrayal, no matter the root causes. As for Ronald, I heard through mutual acquaintances that his marriage imploded, that his own kids refused to speak to him for a while. He managed to keep his job for a bit, but eventually the scandal forced him to resign. Perhaps justice found him in its own slow, grinding way. Allison remains jobless, or so rumor has it, bouncing between menial gigs and short-term apartments. She's a cautionary tale in our old circle of acquaintances, the woman who lost everything chasing a toxic fling with her boss. And from time to time she surfaces, sending me messages tinted with nostalgia or regret. I seldom read them, and when I do, I find no satisfaction in her pleas. She wanted a second chance at life, at success, at love, but she torched the one she had with me. If there's a lesson here, it might be that trust, once shattered, can't always be pieced together. I used to think love conquered all, but love alone can't save a relationship from such a profound breach of faith. The regrets weigh heavy, hers for sure, but also mine. I regret not seeing the cracks earlier, not confronting her about the suspicious signs. But primarily, I regret we reached a point where an affair in our bed was how I discovered the truth. In the end, I found solace in forging a new life, unburdened by her presence. Her pleas for a second chance go unanswered. That might sound cruel, yet it's the boundary I need. The bed she defiled is gone, replaced by new sheets in a different state, a new job, a new horizon. Sometimes at night, I dream about the moment I open the bedroom door. In my dreams, I catch them all over again, but instead of heartbreak, I feel numb acceptance. The next morning, I wake with a sense of clarity. I did what was necessary to protect my dignity. Life goes on, and so do I. She might remain jobless, homeless, and steeped in regret, but I can't be the one to pull her out of that spiral. We had a life together, once, warm, hopeful, and full of promise, but she chose to throw it away in an afternoon of betrayal. That was her decision. Mine was to walk away and never look back.